Page 227, Chapter 8, Women in Camp. And how could one not think of them, even back during interrogation? After all, they were somewhere in here, in neighboring cells, in this very same prison, under the very same regimen, enduring this unbearable interrogation. And how could they bear it, such weak beings? The corridors were soundless, and you could not distinguish their walk or the rustle of their dresses. But one day, one of the Butyrki jailers was fussing with a lock, and left our men's cell to stand half a minute at the windows in the well-lit upper corridor, and peering underneath the muzzle of a corridor window, we suddenly saw down below, in the little green garden, on a corner of asphalt, standing in line, in pairs like us, and also waiting for a door to be opened, women's shoes and ankles. All we could see were just ankles and shoes, but on high heels. And it was like a Wagnerian blast from Tristan and Isolde. We could see no higher than that, and the jailer was already driving us into the cell, and once inside, we raved there, illuminated and at the same time beclouded, and we pictured all the rest to ourselves, imagining them as heavenly beings dying of despondency. What were they like? What were they like? But it seems that things were no harder for them, and maybe even easier. I have so far found nothing in women's recollections of interrogation which could lead me to conclude that they were any more disheartened than we were, and that they became any more deeply depressed. The gynecologist Zubov, who served 10 years himself, and who in camp was constantly engaged in treating and observing women, says, to be sure, that statistically women react more swiftly and more sharply to arrest than men, and to its principal effect, the loss of the family. The woman arrested is spiritually wounded, and this expresses itself most often by the cessation of the vulnerable female functions. But what particularly surprised me in the women's recollections of interrogation was what trifled from a prisoner's point of view, but not at all from a woman's. They could be thinking of their Nadia Surovtseva, pretty and still young, hastily pulled on stockings that didn't match to go to her interrogation. And there, in the interrogator's office, she was embarrassed because the interrogator kept looking at her legs. You would think she should be saying, "To hell with him, horseradish on his snoot." It wasn't as if she were going to the theater with him, and besides, she was almost a doctor of philosophy, in the Western sense, and a fervent political partisan. So who would have thought it? And Alexandra Ostretsova, imprisoned in the Big Lubyanka in 1943, told me later on in camp that they used to kid around in there. They would hide under the table, and the scared jailer would come in to look for the one who was missing, or they would paint themselves red with beet juice and go out like that for their walk. Or, already summoned to interrogation, she would have an animated discussion with her cellmates whether she should dress simply that day or put on her evening dress. True, Ostretsova was, at that time, a spoiled, naughty young girl, and was imprisoned with young Mira Uborovich. But another prisoner, an I.P., older and a scientist, used to sharpen her aluminum spoon in her cell. And what do you think? To cut her throat? No, to cut off her braids. And she did cut them off. Subsequently, in the yard at Krasnaya Prasnya, I happened to be next to a prisoner transport of women who, like us, had been recently sentenced, and with astonishment, I saw that they were not so thin, not so emaciated and pale as we were. Equal prison rations for all and equal prison torments turned out, on the average, to be easier for women. They do not weaken so quickly from hunger. But of course, for all of us, and for women in particular, prison was just a flower. The berries came later, camp, and it was precisely in camp that the women would either be broken or else by bending into degenerating, adapt themselves. In camp it was the opposite. Everything was harder for women than for us men, beginning with the camp filth. Having already suffered in the dirt in the transit prisons and on the prisoner transports themselves, the women would find no cleanliness in camp either. In the average camp, in the women's work brigades, and also, it goes without saying, in common barracks, it was almost never possible for her to feel really clean, to get warm water. Sometimes there was no water at all. In winter, in Camp number 1, it was impossible to wash anywhere in the whole place. The only water was frozen, and there was nowhere to thaw it. There was no lawful way a woman could lay her hands on either cheesecloth or rags. No place there, of course, to do laundry. A bath, well, the initial camp arrival began with a bath. If one doesn't take into account the unloading of the zeks from the cattle car onto the snow, and the march across with one's things on one's back surrounded by convoy dogs, in the camp bath, the naked women were examined like merchandise. Whether there was water in the bath or not, the inspections for lice, the shaving of armpits and pubic hair, gave the barbers, by no means the lowest-ranking aristocrats in the camp, the opportunity to look over the new women, and immediately after that, they would be inspected by the other trustees. This was a tradition going right back to the Solovetsky Islands, except that there, at the dawn of the archipelago, a shyness still existed, not typical of the natives, and they were inspected clothed during auxiliary work. But the archipelago hardened, and the procedure became more brazen. Vedot and his wife, it was their fate to be united. Now recollect with amusement how the male trustees stood on either side of a narrow corridor and passed the newly arrived women through the corridor naked, not all at once, but one at a time. And then the trustees could decide among themselves who got whom. According to the statistics of the 20s, there was one woman serving for every 6 or 7 men, and the decrees of the 30s and 40s after them, the proportion of women to men rose substantially, but not sufficiently for women not to be valued, particularly attractive ones. In certain camps, a polite procedure was preserved. The women were conducted to their barracks, and then the well-fed, self-confident, and impudent trustees entered the barracks, dressed in new padded jackets. Any clothing in camp which was not in tatters and soiled seemed mad foppery. Slowly and deliberately they strolled between the bunks and made their choices. They sat down and chatted. They invited their choices to visit with them, and they were living too, not in a common barrack situation, but in cabins occupied by several men. And there they had not a plate, had a hot plate and frying pans, and they had fried potatoes too. An unbelievable dream. The first time the chosen women were simply feasted, and given the chance to make comparisons, and to discover the whole spectrum of camp life. Impatient trustees demanded payment right after the potatoes, while those more restrained escorted their dates home and explained the future inside the camp compound. Darling, it is being proposed inside in a gentlemanly way. There's cleanliness here, and laundry facilities, and decent clothes and unfatiguing work, and it's all yours. Sorry. And in this sense, it is considered to have been easier for women in camp. It was easier for women to preserve life itself, and with that sexual hatred with which certain of the last Lakers looked on on those women in camp who had not descended to picking from the slops, it was natural to reason that it was easier for women in camp, since they could not get along on a lesser ration. They could get along on a lesser ration, and had a way to avoid starvation and remain alive. For the man crazed by hunger, the entire world is overshadowed by the wings of hunger, and nothing else in this world is of any importance. And it is true there are women who, by their own nature, out in freedom too, by and large, get together with men easily without being choosy. Such women, of course, always had open to them easy ways out. Personal characteristics do not get distributed simply on the basis of the articles of the criminal code. Yet we are not likely to be in error if we say that the majority of women among the 58s were not of this kind. For some of them, from the beginning to the end, this step was less bearable than death. Others would bridle, hesitate, and be embarrassed, and they were held back by shame before their girlfriends too. And when they had finally decided, when they had reconciled themselves, it might be too late. They might not find a camp taker any longer, because not everyone was lucky enough to get propositioned. Thus many of them gave in during the first few days. The future looked too cruel, and there was no hope at all. And this choice was made by those who were almost little girls, along with the solidly married women and mothers of families. And it was the little girls in particular, stifled by the crudity of camp life, who quickly became the most reckless of all. What if you said, no, all right, that's your lookout. Put on breeches and a pea jacket, and go marching off into the woods with your formless, fat exterior and your frail inner being. You'll come crawling yet. You'll go down on bended knee. If you have arrived in the camp in good physical shape, and if you had made a wise decision at the very beginning, then you are all set for a long stay. In the medical section, in the kitchen, in a bookkeeping office, in the sewing shop, or in the laundry, and the years will flow past comfortably enough, quite like out in freedom. And if a prisoner of transport comes your way, you will arrive in your new place too, in full flower, and you will already know how to act there from the very start. One of the most successful moves you can make is to become servant to one of the chiefs. When I.N. arrived in camp on a new prisoner transport, she was a portly, well-preserved woman, who for many years had been the prosperous wife of a high army commander. The chief of the records and classification section immediately spotted her and gave her the post of honor of washing floors in the chief's office, and that was how she began serving out her term in a soft spot, fully aware that this was a piece of luck. And what of it if you loved someone out in freedom and wanted to remain true to him? What profit is there in the fidelity of a female corpse? When you get back to freedom, who is going to need you? Those were the words which kept ringing eternally through the women's barracks. You grow coarse and old, and your last years as a woman are cheerless and empty. Isn't it smarter to hurry up and grab something too, even from this savage life? And it was all made easier by the fact that no one here condemned anyone else. Everyone lives like that here. And hands were also united by the fact that there was no meaning, no purpose left in life. Those who did not give in right off either changed their minds, or else they were compelled to anyway. And even the most stubborn of all, if she was good looking, would give in and go to bed under duress. Give in. In our mini camp at the Kaluga gates in Moscow, there was a proud wench, M, a former lieutenant and a sniper. She was like a fairy princess in a fairy tale, crimson lips, the bearing of a swan, jet black locks, and the fat, dirty old stock clerk. Isaac Bershader decided to buy her. He was nauseating in appearance, and to her, in view of her own resilient beauty, her own recent heroic life, he was particularly repulsive. He was a rotten snag, and she was a tall, beautiful poplar. But he besieged her so persistently and hard, she could hardly breathe. He not only condemned her to general work, all the trustees acted in concert and helped him in his entrapment. She was subjected to harassment by the jailers. He also had the jailers on his hook, and he even threatened her with unassuredly bad prisoner transports to far away. And one evening, when the lights had gone out in the camp, I myself saw how, in a twilight pale, because of snow and sky, M went like a shadow from the women's barracks and knocked with bent head at the greedy Bershader's storeroom. After that, she was well taken care of inside the camp compound. M.N., who was already middle-aged, a draftsman out in freedom, the mother of 2 children, who had lost her husband in prison, had already gone far along the path of a last legger in the Women's Walking Brigade, and still kept on being stubborn, and was close to the point of no return. Her legs swelled up, she stumbled back from work at the tail end of the column, and the convoy would drive her along with blows of their gun stocks. And one day, she somehow stayed behind in the compound. The cook played up to her. "Come on over to my cabin, I will feed you a bellyful." She went. He put a big frying pan of fried potatoes and pork in front of her. She ate it all up, but after she had paid for it, she threw up, and the potatoes were all lost. The cook swore at her, "Just think what a princess," and from then on, she got used to it gradually. She got in a better position, and later, sitting at a camp film showing, she would pick out a man for the night. And anyone who went on waiting longer would have to drag herself to the men's common barracks on her own. Not to the trustees by this time, and walk down the aisles between the bunks, repeating monotonously, half a kilo, and if her rescuer would go with her for a bread ration, then she would curtain off her bunk sheets on 3 sides, and in his tent, this shack up, earn her bread, if the jailer didn't catch her first. A multiple bunk curtained off with rags from the neighboring women was a classic camp scene, but things could be a great deal simpler than that too. This again refers to the Krivage couple, Camp Number 1, 1947 to 49. We know of this number 1, but how many were there? At this camp there were thieves, non-political offenders, juveniles, invalids, women and nursing mothers, all mixed up together. There was just one women's barracks, but it held 500 people. It was indescribably filthy, incomparably filthy and run down, and there was an oppressive smell in it, and the bunks there were without bedding. There was an official prohibition against men entering it, but this prohibition was ignored and no one enforced it. Not only men went there, but the juveniles too. Boys from 12 to 13 who flocked in to learn. First they began with simple observation of what was going on. There was no false modesty there, whether because there were no rags or perhaps not enough time. At any rate, the bunks were not curtained off, and of course the light was never doused either. Everything took place very naturally, as in nature, in full view, and in several places at once. Obvious old age and obvious ugliness were the only defenses for a woman there, nothing else. Attractiveness was her curse. Such a woman had a constant stream of visitors on her bunk and was constantly surrounded. They propositioned her and threatened her with beatings and knives, and she had no hope of being able to stand up against it, but only to be smart about whom she gave in to pick the kind of man to defend her with his name and his knife from all the rest, from the next in line, from the whole greedy queue, from those crazy juveniles gone berserk, aroused by everything they could see and breathe in there. And it wasn't only men that she had to be defended against either, not only juveniles who were aroused. What about the women next to them, who day after day had to see all that but were not themselves invited by the men? In the end, those women too would explode in an uncontrollable rage and hurl themselves on their successful neighbors and beat them up. And then too, venereal diseases were nearly an epidemic at the camp when there was a rumor that nearly half the women were infected, but there was no way out. And on both of the sovereigns and the suppliants kept crossing the same threshold. And only those who were very foresighted, like the accordionist Ch8, who had his own connections in the medical section, could each time call the secret list of the venereal disease patients for himself and his friends in order to not get caught. And what about the women in the Kolyma? After all, women were extremely rare there and in desperate demand. It was better for a woman not to get caught on the work sites there by a convoy guard, a free employer, or a prisoner. The Kolyma was where the expression streetcar for a gang rape arose. Ch8 tells how a truck driver lost at carts a whole truckload of women, including Ch8 herself, being transported to Augen, and turning off the road, he delivered them for the night to a gang of unconvoyed construction workers. Oh, Jesus. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.